Difficult things to do during a time of loss or sickness or suffering or adversity is to pray. Some of you have experienced that. If you lose a loved one, or if you hear that diagnosis from the doctor that you've just been dreading, or if you lose a relationship that meant a lot to you, it's really tough to sustain that prayer life and that prayer time with God. Part of that, I think, is because sometimes there's a sort of emergency prayers, like you can pray and ask God for help when you're in the heat of the moment, but then to sustain that life of prayer, that ongoing daily life of prayer, is difficult because you almost don't know quite what to say, right? You have all this pain and all this anguish and this heartache, and part of you feels like you can't really express that to God. Like God maybe can't hear that, or He can't handle that, and so we sometimes find this temptation to stifle that. Sometimes it might feel fake. It might feel a little bit like even if you come to church and you might feel that, here we get together and we sing, fairly upbeat songs a lot of the time, and the prayers are, we pray together, but then it feels like there's no words to express what you're going through. And so actually to sustain a regular, healthy prayer life of intimacy with God feels very, very difficult. That's a little bit what Job chapter 3 is about. This is really, it's a prayer of sorts. It's a cry of Job in the midst of his pain. And the question is, what does this prayer look like, and what does it mean for us? How does it help us to pray in the midst of our pain? Now, we're going to look at three things as we dig into this text together, and as we go through Job 3, I want us to pay attention to three questions. The first is this: is it okay for us to lament? Is it okay for us to express our pain and our anguish and even our anger to God? And if that's okay, what does it actually look like? What does it look like for you and I to pray these prayers of lament? And then maybe the biggest question of all, how does God respond? How does God respond to us when we lament, when we cry out? Now, we left the story last week with Job's three friends visiting him in the ashes. And we're told that for 7 days, nobody says anything. There's just silence. They sit with Job. They put the ashes on their head. And neither Job nor his friends really say anything at all. And the tension builds. If you think of this, if you're sitting there, you're watching and you're waiting, one day turns into the next, and then it's the third day and the fourth day, and you're wondering, who's going to speak up? And what are they going to say when someone finally breaks the silence? And remember, we've been saying that one of the underlying themes in the whole book is that question of worship. Will Job worship God even in the midst of suffering? Or will Job say, well, now that I'm not getting anything good from God, there's no sense in worshiping anymore? That's kind of the question that is the undercurrent of the whole book. And so as Job hasn't spoken yet, we're left wondering, when Job finally begins to really speak, is Job going to worship God? What will happen when Job finally expresses what's really been weighing on his heart and on his mind? It's maybe it's not exactly the same, but I think there's a parallel that can be drawn. If you've lost someone that you love, if you go through that experience of losing a loved one, usually the first few days are sort of filled with activity. You've got plans and arrangements to make. You kind of get busy making phone calls and travel plans, and you plan a service and so on. And that actually can help maybe pull us away from the pain for just a moment. But oftentimes there comes that moment, maybe 6, 7, 8 days later, where the pain really sets in, and then you begin to say something. And the question is, what do we say? We're going to look in detail at what Job says, but I want you to turn, if you will, look at verse 24. Because verse 24, I think, is a good summary. He's bringing this whole lament to a close, and verse 24, I think, sums up what he's actually, not just what he's saying, but actually what he's doing. And he says, "My sighing comes to me instead of food, and my groans pour out like water." This is one of those places where our English translation just can only take us so far. It's like there are not enough English words here to really capture the fullness of the text. It's a good translation, but there's more going on beneath the surface. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. When we hear that word sighing or groaning, we kind of think of this. Oh, right? That's sighing. That's groaning. It's more of an annoyance. It's more of a frustration. But the word that's used here is a word that it expresses something that's coming from very deep within. It's a very profound, almost an eruption of pain and anguish that all comes up at once. I'll give you an example. In Psalm 22, verse 1, the same word is used there. And in Psalm 22, verse 1, it starts off, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my groaning?" Now, in that context, you don't hear, my God, why are you forsaking me? Right? You hear what's really going on. You hear deep anguish. You hear pain. You hear great, profound suffering. And that's what Job is doing here. Now, I don't know how you feel about that in terms of when you see someone sighing or groaning like that. I don't know what your reaction is. If you're chatting with a friend and all of a sudden they start pouring out their anguish in their heart and soul, and it's like it's just pouring out of them, I think there's a sense in which a lot of us would be intimidated by that. We might even, maybe we wouldn't say it, but we would think, come on, get it together. Keep a stiff upper lip. Don't show that kind of emotion. Come on, that's not appropriate. Western culture tends to take that approach. Eastern culture, Asian culture is better at expressing the real anguish and mourning. Western culture, we tend to, hey, come on, stiff upper lip, be strong, get it together. And I wonder if maybe part of that is rooted in some conviction that it's not appropriate for Christians to express this kind of pain to God. You need to be strong. But let me push on that a little bit, and let me suggest that actually Christianity, biblically properly understood, is the one religion, the one worldview that actually encourages this kind of pain. And let me explain what I mean by that. Pagan religions, whether in Israelites' day or whether in modern times, pagan religions were often rooted in the idea that you had to make sure to be on your best behavior for God. Don't show too much emotion. Don't rock the boat, because at the end of the day, you need to make sure that God is going to make the rain fall on your crops and make sure that you're healthy. And if you rock the boat too much, if you express too much anguish before God, then the gods might be a little fed up with you. Right? So pagan religions and even many modern day religions that operate on this assumption of, we have to behave ourselves, we have to be strong before God, they don't allow any room for lament. That's too much rocking the boat. Now, we're in the Pacific Northwest. Paganism, other religions are not as prominent here. We're part of the country that tends to be more secular. Right? We put God out of the picture. And when you cut God out of the picture, do you realize what happens? You have no place to go with this lament, or at least you have no upward direction to go. You can't cry out to God. So what do we do here in the Pacific Northwest? We take to the streets, right? We protest. Think of it this way. I think many times, not always, but many times protest is a secular form of lament. It's a way of saying there's something really wrong with this world, and since we don't think there's anywhere we can go up, we just go out. We protest. We get angry. Job cries out to God. And his crying out to God, his lament is rooted in something much deeper. His lament is rooted in the idea that he is coming before a covenant God who is faithful to his people no matter what. The idea of lament, biblically speaking, is rooted in the idea that God listens to his children. He listens to his people. He hears them no matter what they are saying to him. Right? Lament assumes that God is not some remote, distant deity up there in the clouds and who doesn't want to hear us unless we're buttering him up. A genuine relationship with God assumes that it's personal. It assumes that there's room to cry out to God. And in that way, when Job finally speaks, his speech is a form of worship. His lament is a form of worship. Maybe not worship as we're used to thinking of it, but it's an expression of trust in a faithful and covenant God. Now, let's go a little deeper. So is it okay to lament? Yes, it's an expression of worship. But what does it actually look like to lament? Well, Job's lament is really broken into two parts, and I'm going to show you big picture here. If you have your Bible still open, look at the left-hand column, chapter 3. The two parts to this lament break down like this. Chapter 3, verses 1 through 10, and then verses 11 through the end of the chapter. And I say it breaks into two parts because there's two main themes in each one. One theme in each section. Look at the left column of chapter 3 and look at the word that you see repeated over and over again. May the day, may God above, may darkness, may a cloud, may blackness, may it not be included, may that night be barren, and so on, over and over and over again. That word may. That's really a marker of lament. It's a way of praying a curse on the day that Job was born. He's wishing that the day that he was born would be swallowed up by the darkest of nights. Right? So that's the first main theme. May this happen. It's a prayer, in a sense, to God, wishing that God would swallow up the day of his birth in the deepest darkness. That's important because what Job is doing is he's pronouncing a curse on the day of his birth. But here's why that matters. Remember, the thing that Satan said to God was, you know what, Job is going to curse you. When you let Job suffer, he's going to curse you. Now, Job doesn't do that. He curses instead the day of his birth, and he says, may this day be swallowed up by darkness. He even says, may that day of my birth perish, the night it was said a baby is born. There's other translations that say the night that I was conceived. That's very personal, it's very intimate, but the message is this. May these two wonderful moments that are supposed to be filled with joy, may they instead be counted as deep darkness. Job is really saying that my life is so bad that even the greatest joy cannot outweigh the suffering I'm experiencing right now. And that becomes more obvious when you start to look in verses 11 through 23. Job expresses this moment of curse. He curses the day that he was born. Then he moves into verses 11 to 23, and he starts asking questions. Again, you can look down the left-hand column of the page, each beginning, or many of the beginning sentences. Why? Why did I not perish at birth? Why were there knees to receive me? And going on over and over again. Why is light given to those in misery? It's not quite as obvious in this section as it is in the first, but it's still there. It's that move from grief to confusion. Job is really saying, if my life is as bad as it is now, why was I even born? For what purpose? What purpose? If I would be born into such a miserable life, it would have been better that I was never born at all. Now let's go a little deeper, especially I really want to look at the first section, the moment where Job is putting a curse or praying a curse over the day that he was born. One of the themes woven throughout all of that, and I mentioned it already, but it's that theme of darkness. May darkness swallow up the light of day. Now what's fascinating to me is that it's like Job has a thesaurus open on his desk, and he looks and he turns to the page where it says darkness, and he finds maybe 6 or 7 synonyms here, 6 or 7 different words for darkness, and he uses all of them. He uses as many words as he possibly can to talk about darkness and shadows and thick darkness. There are a whole bunch of words. It's like Job, he's grasping at language to put into words the pain that he's experiencing. And you can't read all of that. You can't read about this idea about darkness swallowing up the light of his birth. You can't read that without thinking back to Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 1 is that moment of creation where God, what is the first thing that God does? The first thing that God does to bring order out of the chaos, to bring creation into being, he separates the darkness from the light. He brings the light out of the darkness. And now Job is saying, things are so bad that I want my days to go back into the darkness. To put it a little bit differently, Job is really saying that his suffering, this loss and this sickness and this illness and disease, he's saying really this is like creation working backwards. It's like uncreation. And if you stop and think about it, isn't that a perfect description of what suffering is? If you've been diagnosed with an illness, there's a sense in which that disease is the uncreation of health and wholeness, whether it be cancer or Parkinson's disease or depression. It's not the way this world was meant to be. It's something being uncreated. If you've gone through the loss of relationship, a breakdown of a marriage, for example, that's the uncreation of the relationship God intends us to have. It's the breakdown of that trust and that intimacy and that vulnerability that we're meant to have. If you lose your job at 60 years old and now you don't know how are you going to get a job, make it to retirement, that's a crisis. And it's the uncreation of purpose, the purpose that you were put here in this world for, to serve God through our labor. Suddenly it feels like you have no purpose. It's uncreation. And of course, the ultimate of all uncreation is death itself. The uncreation of life. You see what Job is getting at here? Do you see what how he's describing suffering? It's uncreation. It's working backwards. Now, of course, we've already asked the question, what are we supposed to do with this? When you're going through a period of uncreation, what do you do? Well, God invites his children, his people, you and me, to express this pain to him in worship. He invites us to express this to him. Now, some of you are thinking to yourself, how do you do that? Where do you start? Maybe you're going through something today. Or maybe it's something that happened a long, long time ago, but you've never really dealt with it. So it's always just kind of lingering there. What do you do with this? How do you lament? If you aren't sure where to start, let me suggest that you become well acquainted with the Psalms. There are 150 Psalms, and approximately one-third of them, are Psalms of lament. Now think about that just for one moment. One-third. Does that tell you something about how God understands our need to lament? Like, it's not just that there's one or two of them, but it's about 50 of them. And becoming familiar with these Psalms and using them, praying through them, using them devotionally, can actually help us put into words some of the things that we might be experiencing. It can put into words our pain. It can put into words our crying out for God's presence. Where is God in all of this? Why doesn't God listen to me when I'm praying? So become familiar with the Psalms. Use them. They're the prayer book for God's people, and they can help us express the pain that we're experiencing. Psalm 13, Psalm 88 are two good places to start if you aren't sure where do you go from the Psalms. But maybe it's not the Psalms. Maybe you just learn in your own devotional life to pray your pain before God. That's what God invites us to do. Now, the million-dollar question is, what does God say to lament? How does he respond? We cry out to God. Does God listen? And if he listens, how does he respond to us? Well, God's ultimate answer to lament, of course, is his Son, Jesus. Jesus is God's response to the lament of this world. Jesus is God's response to the pain and suffering of this world. But obviously that's a bit too simplistic. So let's dig a little bit deeper into that. What does it mean that God responds to lament through his Son, Jesus? First things first. Let's look at a story. It's John chapter 11. We don't need to turn there now, but because it's a story that many of you have probably heard at least once before. It's the story of Jesus at the tomb of his friend Lazarus. And you remember, now think this through. His friend has just died. There's all kinds of people from the surrounding community. They gather together to weep and to mourn. Jesus knows that he's going to walk up to that tomb and he's going to say, Lazarus, come out. And Lazarus is going to walk out. Jesus knows that. So if there was ever anyone who could have walked into a crowd of people who were mourning and lamenting and said, hey, everybody, it's okay. I'm here. Don't worry. Come on. Settle down. Stiff upper lip. Be strong. It would have been Jesus. Jesus could have said, I'm going to make this all better, so don't worry about it. Stop your crying. But of course, Jesus doesn't do that. We're told a number of times in that text that Jesus weeps with them. We're also told that when he comes to the grave, Jesus actually, it says that he groans in his spirit. Do you know what? Guess what word that is? Do you see where I'm going with this? Jesus actually, he uses the same version of that word we ran into in Job 3. He groans deeply. Something deep within Jesus just responds in the deepest anguish to the sickness, the disease, and the ultimate death in this world. Jesus responds just like Job did. Here's what that means for you and for me. To learn to weep, to learn to lament, is actually a mark of Christ-likeness. It's a mark of maturity in Christ to be able to weep in the face of sickness and suffering and death. It's a mark of Christ-likeness. It's not Christ-like to look at something as awful as death and say, well, just be strong. That's not what Jesus does. So that's the first thing. But that's not the only answer that Jesus gives to lament. Remember back to Job 3, and Job pronounces a curse on the day of his birth. He says, I wish I had never been born. I wish darkness would swallow up the day of my birth. I wish darkness would overcome the light of my birth. Now consider what Jesus does on the cross. What happens on the cross from 6 till about 9? Darkness overwhelms the light of the world. The darkness of God turning his face away swallows up the light of the world. And the curse of darkness doesn't fall on Job, but it falls on Jesus. And in that moment, do you remember one of the things that Jesus said? Do you remember one of the ways that Jesus cried out? He quoted Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? And if you were a good Jewish person and you knew your Bible, the rest of that psalm would come to mind. Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my groaning? See, Jesus entered into the deepest darkness. The deepest darkness overwhelmed him, and when Jesus cried out and lamented, there was no one to answer. When Jesus cried out to God from the depths of suffering, facing death itself, when he groaned, no one answered. Heaven was silent. The deepest darkness fell on Jesus, and the one who created the world, the one in whom the whole world holds together, the one in whom creation finds its being, that one became uncreated. And why did he do that? He did it so that the darkness will never swallow us up. So that the darkness of this world, the darkness of our suffering, the darkness of our anguish and our pain will never overpower us, will never overcome us. Jesus went through the darkness so that it won't overpower us. Now, that's not to say that we won't suffer. That's not to say Jesus went to the cross so that our lives will all be free from pain. Of course not. We know that to not be true. But it's to say that Jesus endured the deepest darkness so that our darkness might be changed. So that our darkness isn't so much like the deepest, darkest night of midnight, but it's so that it's more like those moments before dawn where that first sliver of sun just breaks over the horizon. It's dark, but it's darkness with the hope of morning. And one day, that darkness with the hope of morning will give way to the brightest day. Will give way to that brightest light of the city of God, where there's no sun because Jesus is the sun. Jesus is the light. There's no need for the sun. It's that place where in Revelation 21 we read that darkness is forever gone, and there's no more mourning or crying or tears or pain or suffering. All that's gone. That's our hope. That's what Jesus does with our darkness. That's what he does with our pain. On the cross, he was swallowed up by it so that he might bring us into the glorious light of a new day. Let's pray. Lord our God, we give you